Just thank you. Let me just start this PowerPoint. There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Marta, for those kind words of introduction. Welcome to everybody. I'm, extremely pleased to be here and, speaking to such an international group of scholars. So, as Marta mentioned, I'm a historian of the early modern world, that is about the period 1500 to 1800. And of course, a question one immediately asks oneself is, what is this non-classical cuckoo doing in a classical nest? And yeah, the answer is that I'm coming to you by the route of classical reception. I studied the history of extinction in the 17th and 18th centuries, and hey, it turns out that the reception of classical works played a crucial role in formulating those early ideas. And in my sort of final two slides, I'll show you a bit of that research, but I also wanted to investigate the ancient texts for themselves to sort of better understand this, and that sort of impelled me really to write this talk and speak to you on this topic. So one gateway into this question is a book published in the year 2000 by Princeton University Press by Adrian Mayer and the First Fossil Hunters. And Mayer makes a discovery that I think is quite extraordinary, namely that the creatures of classical myths, giants, cyclops, griffins, and so forth, were in fact based in fact. That the fossils of what we now know are dinosaurs and mastodons, in fact, inspired and in many ways were crucial sort of catalysts of the way the ancient world thought of mythical creatures. And she really sort of overwhelmingly demonstrates this to be the case, that, sort of even, Emperor Augustus, for example, in his villa on the island of Capri, had a whole museum full of fossil remains, which he thought were the creatures from mythological history. And that's really kind of opened up a completely new line of investigation that I want to follow. Another way of approaching extinction would be to look at what environmental historians of the ancient world have worked on. For example, Donald Hughes, who talks about a kind of sort of ecological consciousness of the ancients, that certain species that were abundant in a certain area, that the sort of ancients were very perceptive about the fact that certain species that were abundant in a certain area sort of disappeared and vanished over time, right? So Hughes gives examples of Pliny, for example, talking about certain species of birds that haven't been seen in generations and seem to have vanished. Aristotle talks about scallops that were fished and dredged to such a degree that they never came back to the Mediterranean, etc., etc. But in my talk today, I want to focus my sort of spotlight on a different aspect of thinking about extinction, one that is grounded in catastrophic narratives of natural destruction and the kind of extinction events those natural catastrophes caused. And this is of some recent interest, right? So here's the cover of Time magazine from 1985, based off of the hypothesis of Louis and Walter Alvarez, this paleontologist, father and son duo from UC Berkeley in 1980, who proposed that a meteorite crashed in the Earth 65 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs. So this is actually a recent hypothesis. It's a return to a kind of catastrophic way of thinking that sort of various mass extinctions occurred in cycles in nature's past, And that is the kind of thinking I'm tracing in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, but that is also deeply reflected upon in the ancient world. And now I just want to sort of jump right in, sort of classical study style, into the sources and just sort of investigate this this topic with you. So I start with Seneca. Seneca's Natural Questions, right? He's writing at the time of Nero. He composes about in the 60s AD, and he's really writing a treatise on meteorology, the kind of the science of the ancient science of earthquakes, floods, lightning, these kind of natural occurrences and catastrophes. And one might ask, of course, what is one of the most famous Stoics doing, writing about the natural world? And I think a tentative answer is that knowledge of the natural world is really kind of the basis for Seneca's ethics. That only if we can understand nature's course and our place in it, then we can act correctly within the world. And anyway, in his third book, in the Natural Questions on Water, he comes to talk about the catastrophic floods that had visited the Earth in previous times. I'll get to some of the sources he looks at and discusses, and his expectancy that this flood will come again. So he says, this topic, water, reminds me to inquire how most of the earth is overwhelmed by the waves when the fated day of the flood arrives. And then he goes on to discuss a variety of causes for this flood. Will the oceans rise? Will rain pour down? And then at the end he says, or does everything come together to destroy the human race? He goes on to say, to sort of pass this in different kinds of language, nature arrives at ruin suddenly at full speed. That's one way he describes these catastrophic floods, or that any deviation from nature is sufficient for the destruction of mortals. So the reason I'm showing you these quotations is just to give you a sense of the kind of vocabulary he developed. So exitium, destruction, or ruina, ruin, is the are the kinds of words he uses. And then I think here is the most striking passage, where he says, once the destruction of the human race is complete, there's that exitium again, and the wild animals are likewise extinct, extinctis feris, then sort of the water of the flood will reside again, the ocean will be thrown out of our territory, driven into its hiding places, and the old order, or the ancient order, antiquus ordo, will be restored. Every kind of animal will be created again. So what we really have here is an idea of the total destruction of the world, then it will be reborn again as it was. And I think sort of at the core of this is a kind of cyclical notion of natural reoccurrence. And it seems to fit very well into his Stoicism, right? Where you have this eternal reoccurrence of events. There's a kind of inevitability of nature that you have to cope with and accept. And I think it's important to note here that Seneca is, of course, not inventing any kind of new theory, but rather his question is much more compiling various sort of previous sources and thoughts about cyclical, reoccurring disasters. And one of the sources he looks at is Aristotle. I'll get to Aristotle in a bit, but I think probably the most interesting source he looks at is Ovid, just writing about 60 years before him in the Metamorphoses, right? This is the famous first book where we've gone through the gold, bronze, silver, bronze age. The giants have rebelled against the gods, but have been sort of destroyed. Humans have degenerated from a kind of paradise-like situation into warfare and have become corrupted. And Jupiter decides, right, here he's speaking, but now I'm forced to commit the whole race of mankind to destruction. So perdendum est mortale genus. The flood of Deucalion comes in. The rivers engulf the plains and the valleys, the orchards along with the crops, and the cattle along with the people. Everything is swept to oblivion. The world was reduced to an ocean without any coastline. And then at the end, all but a few have been drowned by the flood, and any survivors for shortage of food are destroyed by a long, drawn-out starvation. Now we could sort of maybe discuss about whether destroyed is the right translation there, right? Dormant, overcome maybe, but the important point is that even those few who survive on the mountaintop, in the end, die out, right? Everything is gone except Deucalion, sort of the son of Prometheus and his wife. And like Seneca, what we have is a rebirth of the world after that, right? Seneca's drawing on Ovid. Sort of the floods subside. What is left is this kind of boggy marsh, which begins to sort of putrefy and begin to sort of start to sort of teem with life again and sort of create new animals. The earth brought forth innumerable species. Some of the forms which emerged were old, right, antiquas figuras. Others that were created were new and monstrous. Among these monstrous forms was an unknown serpent, right, Python, which was also brought forth by the earth at the time, though she cannot have wished for it. So at this point, I kind of want to return to Maya and say, if we are to take her thesis seriously, that fossilized beings were widely known in the ancient world and provided inspirations and even visualizations for sort of mythological creatures from the past, then it sort of makes me reread these passages definitely in a quite different light, and really that these tales of destruction and extinction really are connected to sort of the evidence that we now sort of ascribe to around that we call paleontology, right? And lo and behold, in the 15th book of the Metamorphoses, Ovid does cite fossils. He doesn't cite fossil bones, but he does cite fossil shells on mountaintops as evidence that the world was once covered in the sea. I want to sort of cycle back to Seneca again, who discusses Ovid in depth as one of his sources, right? And Seneca writes, "It suits the grandeur of the subject when Ovid writes, the world was reduced to an ocean without any coastline." So he's praising Ovid, but then he critiques him when he says, "If only he had not reduced the momentum of his inventiveness and subject to childish silliness with the verse, the wolf swims among the sheep and the waves support tawny lions. Is swimming possible in that deluge and that devastation? Has not every beast been drowned by the same force that has swept it away?" So here what Seneca is saying is that Ovid is really not sort of, is not coming with the right gravitas to the situation. He's he's kind of adding a sort of poetic embellishment by saying these wolves and sheep are sort of circling around in whirlpools, but that doesn't actually underscore the seriousness of an event that, as he says, drowned every beast, right? Pecus omne. Now, at this point, of course, we might ask, well, aren't these kind of myths, creation stories, sort of how kind of scientifically, let's say, minded are these narrative constructions? And I think the first thing to mention, of course, is that this flood that is described here, the flood of Deucalion, which we have here in Seneca and Ovid, was seen as a historical event, right? A little bit later, we have Pseudo-Polydorus, or at least the author of the Bibliotheca, let's put it like that, who describes it as a historical event. Aristotle, right, the deluge in the time of Deucalion, for instance, took place chiefly in the Greek world and especially in ancient Hellas. But the interesting aspect that I want to bring here is that on the one hand, Aristotle affirms this feature that I've been trying to bring out about the cycle nature of time, right? A place does not always remain land or sea throughout all time, but where there was dry land, there comes to be sea, and where there is now sea, there one day comes to be dry land. And he describes this as some order, taxin, and a cycle, periodos. But I think the most interesting section is at the bottom there, when he says that these changes escape observation because these changes take too long for records of them to survive. It's over so long periods of time, which are so vast compared to the length of our life, and whole peoples are destroyed and perish before they can record the process from beginning to end. And we have a similar sort of passage we can find in Plato's Timaeus, where Solon is talking to an Egyptian priest, and Solon informs the priest about this flood of Deucalion that we've just witnessed, how it's sort of been received through these various sources. And the Egyptian priest sort of answers to Solon by saying, the memorials which your own and other nations have once had of the famous actions of mankind perish in the waters at certain periods, and the rude survivors in the mountains begin again, knowing nothing of the world before the flood. But in Egypt, the traditions of our own and other lands are by us registered forever in our temples. The genealogies which you have recited to us out of your own annals, Solon, are a mere children's story. For in the first place, you remember one deluge only, and there were many of them, and you know nothing of that fairest and noblest race of which you are a seed or remnant. The memory of them was lost because there was no written voice among you. So the reason I've highlighted this passage and the passage from Aristotle's meteorology is that I think when we're talking about notions of extinction in the ancient world, I think the element of time is also important. That an important part of our concept of sort of an idea of extinction, I think, is that that no written records really exist of these events. That all you have are the natural remains of the world, right? A scarred world after a catastrophe has sort of caused a mass extinction event. And I just wanted to sort of underscore that aspect of it, in addition to the aspect that fossils proved a crucial inspiration and also mode of visualization. And I kind of want to conclude now just by jumping ahead a bit. Got about 2 minutes left, and sort of looking at 2 examples of the reception. One, this is a favorite example from the 16th century, a fossil fish that was dug up in Bavaria and that ended up in the Cabinet of Curiosities of Ferdinand II, the Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, where then someone inscribed verses of epic poetry, in this case from Virgil, it's a cento, onto this slab with the fossil fish, dated it 1543, right, creating a kind of inscription. And just look at the bottom there, et genus omne neci pecudum dedit omne ferarum, right? God gives every kind of animal, every kind of beast, death. So here the ancient text is kind of reappropriated in a sort of Christian context, where it is read as a remnant of the deluge and sort of reinterpreted in this new setting. A second kind of more, for lack of a better word, secular example will be this. Then 100 years later, in the 17th century, the natural philosopher Robert Hooke. On the left-hand side, he's looking at ammonites, these giant spiral shells. They can be about 7 feet wide, of a completely extinct sea creatures. And on the right-hand side, he's going through the exact verses of Ovid, of Metamorphoses, the verses that I just went through and quoted to you, looking for evidence about whether the ancients had an idea about past catastrophes and trying to sort of narrativize what you see on the left through the Ovid that you have on the right, right? So that's a kind of very fascinating way that it's sort of classical reception is brought back to life. So yeah, I think I'll just conclude here with with those images, and yeah, look forward to the Q&A and your further thoughts. But thank you for listening. Yes.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for